So, anyway, the first doorway that I looked into looked like hell. There were people shrieking and screaming, and there were naked human beings strewn about, this horrid landscape with pools of bubbling excrement, and there's boulders, and animals were torturing people, and people were torturing each other, and, there were creatures with pitchforks.
Oh, my God.
And, erupting flame geysers, and it was the artist's classic depiction of hell.
Well, let me stop you right there. This
Sure.
is the most detailed description I've ever heard. I want you to hear something, Sarah.
Sure.
There was a story about Siberia, and they drilled, it was said, the world's deepest hole in Siberia. And the scientists who drilled the hole heard something, and they lowered a microphone as far as they could into the hole, and they made a recording. And I had a listener who sent me a copy of that recording, and I want to play that recording. It's only a few seconds long. Listen very carefully. Based on what you just described in the room that you saw, the room that seemed like hell, I wonder if it sounded like this. Sarah?
Oh, I just got goosebumps all over my body.
Me too.
Oh, that was just exactly like what it sounded like. That is amazing.
I don't know if I wanted to hear that, but when you said that, I couldn't resist. So you had that much sensory perception. You not only saw, but you heard.
Well, not only that, it got worse in that as I got close to this doorway, I was in kind of the center of the hall, and I looked in and saw this scene, and I was like, whoa. And then I went toward this door. I kind of floated toward it, and there was a sucking sensation near this door, kind of like a whirlpool. And I got actually sucked into the hell. And I was kind of catapulted above it, and I was floating above this scene, which is one reason why I can describe it in such great detail, is because I was in there for a while, listening to it, looking at it, just, again, horrified and awed by what I was witnessing, because the scenes of torment were so incredibly imaginative and different. There was every imaginable thing going on in there, It was just that you can think of in terms of torture and human misery. It was happening in there.
And you were sucked into it.
And I was sucked into it, yeah.
But you were above it, seeing
I was above it, yes. I didn't have to. It wasn't as if anything was reaching for me. It was more as if I was observing it.
Good Lord. At this point, Sarah, at any point during all of this, didn't you begin to intellectualize your situation and ask yourself, where am I and what's happened to me? Or was it so natural that you just never went through that process?
Really, while this whole thing was happening, I never questioned why it was happening. I questioned what was happening in terms of, is this even possible at all? But I never questioned why it was happening. It just seemed as if it was something that I needed to see,
Or maybe you were familiar with it.
Pardon me?
Could it be possible that, Sarah, you were familiar with it because you'd been there before?
That's very possible. I have no idea. All I know is that it had a strange fascination to me in its horrible way.
But you weren't yet really part of it.
No, I didn't have to be part of it. I was floating above it. And then there was at one point where, kind of like when you're watching a horror movie and you decide, all right, that's enough of this.
Yes.
And I moved back. I said, all right, I'm leaving. And I went back toward the door, which was The doorway out into the tunnel was visible from everywhere in this landscape. No matter where you looked, you could always see the door, and the door was always open. And you could see the tunnel, the cloud of tunnel, and in there it seemed very calm, especially considering with the tumult that's all around.
Well, an obvious question is, though, those who were in that hell couldn't get to that door while you could.
I think my feeling about this is because of what happened next, which was actually I left without any difficulty. And as I was passing through the door, my thought at that point was that the people that were in this scene could leave it at any time. They just weren't aware that they could, because they were so caught up in their own idea that they needed to suffer.
Or perhaps...
And they say the door to hell is always open.
Yeah, perhaps they were keeping themselves there.
Yes, they were.
Have you seen the recent Robin Williams movie?
Yes, I did, on your recommendation, actually.
Really?
Yes.
It must have jolted you pretty hard.
It was interesting, but not exactly the same as my experience, only because he never had the idea of the tunnel, and the tunnel was so primary for mine.
Right.
But his idea of hell was tame for me.
Tame compared to what you saw?
Tame compared to what I saw, yes.
Well, all of this is confusing to the layman, because when you start talking about clouds and light and being a blue light, that begins to sound kind of spiritual on the good side, not...
I don't know if it was necessarily spiritual on the good side. I think, actually, it's more what form humans may take when they lose their body, or what form we perceive this particular experience in. I don't know, This is...
Well, in What Dreams May Come and some other motion pictures that have been produced, there is the concept that people essentially sentence themselves to hell.
Yes, and that's what I think, too. I think so, definitely, from the experience that I had, that those people had sentenced themselves.
All right,
That's what I've gotten from all of my research also, Art.
Yeah.
So you left there on your own. You got out.
I felt really lucky, too, because I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to get out because that sucking sensation had been so strong coming in. And, even as I was leaving, I could sort of feel the energy kind of pouring back in, sort of, if anything else unwary kind of came along, it was also going to get sucked in, So it was pretty interesting in that respect. And then I was back in the tunnel.
Back in the tunnel of clouds and doors.
Right, tunnel of clouds and doors.
Okay.
So I decided I was going to keep going up the tunnel. And so the next world that I looked into, which was, I don't remember if it was exactly the one right next to the hell, but the next door that I looked in that I have a conscious memory of was also a kind of hell. It was a kind of a completely yellow landscape that was flat. And there were people, and they were just walking. And they had their heads down, and they were totally depressed and totally self-absorbed in this utter miserable state of mind. And they walked past each other, and they walked next to each other, and they were totally oblivious that anybody else was there, and that was all that was happening, except there was a sun in the sky that would cast incredibly long shadows of these people across the landscape. And again, there was this sense here, again, of another kind of misery. It wasn't as graphic.
Not as torturous.
No, but it was, on certain levels, it was worse, because these people were completely isolated and alone. And in their isolation and in their loneliness, they were utterly lost and miserable.
Oh, my God.
Oh, that's what I thought, too. When I looked in that world, I was like, oh, my God.
All right, Sarah.
That one I didn't have to go into, though. That one I managed to... There was no sucking sensation at that door. I just looked at it.
You looked at it
and said, wow.
Enough of this place. All right, hold on, Sarah, and hold on, Dr. Jeff Long and Tricia McGill. I'm Art Bell, and I don't think I've ever heard as graphic a description of a trip to a place of this kind. Ever. This is somebody who flatlined 5 times, was thrown 60 feet by an automobile.
So there is part 2. Now, as the old saying again goes, you ain't heard nothing yet. I mean, this story just kept going and going and going. And obviously, this was written actually for her as she related it. A number of people have asked, well, how was it written? Well, it was written for her and or written by her when she was able to finally write. And so all of this is a very fresh recollection that you're hearing. Why would a church volunteer, a young lady without too many marks on the negative side, face something like she is obviously facing? And as I said, you just haven't heard it all yet by a long shot. I don't know, but it profoundly affected me because as I listened to her, and I like to think of myself as a pretty good judge of voices and people, it was obvious to me that she was absolutely telling the truth as she precisely recalled it. Don't you have that impression? Not just telling a story to be on the radio at all, nothing like it. In fact, we had to drag her to the radio to get her to do this. But once she got into it, it should be obvious to anybody listening that this was an actual, true experience that this young lady had. And the question remains, why? And is that really what awaits all of us? But, we're not done yet. Stay right where you are. The best part lies directly ahead.
This is Premier Networks. That was Art Bell hosting Coast to Coast AM on this Somewhere in Time. You are listening to Art Bell, Somewhere in Time. Tonight featuring Coast to Coast AM from April 20th, 2001.
You haven't heard it all yet. More of Sarah coming right up. I'm Art Bell. This is Coast to Coast AM.
Back now to Dr. Jeff Long, Tricia McGill, and Sarah. Sarah, welcome back.
Thank you.
All right, well, it takes a lot of guts, I think, especially publicly, to talk about this. I've never heard anything as detailed as this in my life from somebody like you, ever.
Well, it really absolutely, utterly changed my life forever, and it has been the pivotal event in my existence ever since then. And one of the reasons why I want to communicate it is so that I can move forward with this and join with other people in sort of celebrating this event, so that it no longer is something that is, just my own. And, it's just it takes a lot of energy. And especially with something like this where you don't have any precedent in your existence for such a thing, how do you fit that back into an ordinary reality when you return to it?
I don't know. I don't know
either. I haven't done a very good job with that.
All right. Well, let's finish it. You came out of this second room where people were on a yellow floor, sort of.
Yes.
In just sort of a horribly depressed state, and you sort of looked in that one and didn't spend much time. Said, let's.
No, I just felt a great deal of compassion for these people again, because it seemed again like they were choosing this state.
Yeah.
Like they didn't have any idea that this was not what they had to be at all. But unfortunately, they didn't have any idea of that. All they knew is that this is what it was. Mm-hmm. And just to see all these different human beings just passing each other by like ships in the night and having no idea that anybody else was there, mm-hmm. was just so isolating and lonely.
Were, other than that, those creatures, which more than noticed you, came after you, did anybody in any one of these rooms, were they aware you were there, do you think?
No, it was more like looking in an aquarium, kind of like that idea.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Because in both cases, the tunnel was kind of above these landscapes, so it was very much a kind of a looking down on them.
I've got you.
Okay.
Then what?
Well, then I decided to keep continuing up the tunnel, and the next world that made any sort of impression on me was kind of a very different one in the aspect of it was the most beautiful thing that I'd ever seen. And in that way, the Robin Williams film touched me very deeply because the kind of color that he had there and the beautiful waterfalls and bridges and fountains, and it was sparkling and iridescent and welcoming, and I could hear the sounds of birds and all this other thing going on in there, and it was like, oh boy, well, I definitely want to go in there.
By the way, folks, it's called What Dreams May Come.
Yes, it was wonderful. But this world, later, in fact, several years later, after I had this experience, I saw the paintings of an artist named Gilbert Williams. And this world was very much like his paintings, if you're familiar with his work at all.
I'm not.
Okay. But anyway, it was luminescent. Everything was lit from within and sparkling and living and gorgeous. And it was very interesting because as I went toward this world, of course I wanted to go in there. I was like, oh, yeah. As I started to pass through the doorway, it was as if my little star nose got stuck against a piece of plastic wrap, and I couldn't go any further in to this world.
Oh.
And a voice, kind of almost as if I touched a doorbell, a voice said, you do not have the information to enter this world. And I was terribly disappointed, but I thought, okay, well, what can I do? You know, I can't go any further. In fact, I remember I kind of tried to push through this transparent covering over this world,
right,
but it didn't work. I didn't go in.
You don't have the information
to enter this world, yes. And I thought, well, okay. And I thought to myself, well, I'm certainly going to get the information wherever somehow I will get the information to enter that world. But that was a big disappointment for me.
Right.
So at that point, I was kind of very much near the end of the tunnel in terms of where it branched to the right.
Okay.
And so as in my little star self, I turned around, and there, in this right branching, was a big yellow and white light that was very bright and intense and beautiful and wonderful. So I decided, okay, well, may as well go into the light. So I went into the light, and I'm in the light, and I feel this incredible feeling of joy and happiness and bliss, and I notice that that's the only thing that I can feel. There's nothing else going on there but joy and happiness and bliss and celestial, harmony, and it was overwhelming. And I said to the light, I said, I'm here. And the light said, in this kind of big voice, it said, great,
Great.
And then, yeah, it said great, and then I kind of gave myself up to the light. I merged with it. I myself became nothing but eternal joy and bliss and happiness. And I kind of floated in this state for quite some time. And in this state, I lost my fear of death. And I learned a lot of things that are all kind of personal truths for me about myself in this state of joy and bliss. And this lasted for an unknown period of time. And then...
Again, let me ask you, were you in that state? I've experienced, Sarah, something like that in not an NDE, but an out-of-body experience I had just instantaneously. So I know just a little tiny bit about it.
Yes.
Could you intellectualize, obviously something was going on because you were recognizing these things about yourself. So
yes.
So you had some sort of awareness.
Yes, it was definitely a learning state and a healing state at the same time. But I was aware of myself. Again, I never lost my awareness of who I was, ever.
Okay.
No matter what was happening, even in the state of utter joy and bliss. I was in utter joy and bliss, and yet the joy and bliss was also outside me and happening around me. And at one point, to be perfectly honest with you, it got kind of dull. And so I decided that I was going to leave this place of joy and bliss. And so I said to the light, I said, I'm leaving. And the light said, great. And I thought, okay.
You know, so far I'm right with you, because the feeling of eternal joy and bliss would, after a while, I suppose, sort of.
And I guess that sounds kind of sacrilegious.
It does, but it'd be almost boring. In other words, you'd tire of it.
I did. I tired of it because, in certain levels, it was exhausting because it was never ending.
Yeah.
You know, there was nothing but that. There was no other emotion expressed. It was always joy and bliss.
So the light
was very wonderful.
The light said, "Great."
Yeah. So and I had an idea that it doesn't matter on a personal level. You know, it didn't matter if I was there or if I wasn't there. This light was always going to be in eternal joy and bliss.
You were welcome to come, welcome to go.
Exactly. And so that was just wonderful. So, and then, you know, and I remember thinking, well, okay, well, all right, well, I'm leaving now. And I kind of went rather quickly back down the tunnel, and I paused. This is now we're kind of near the end of this here.
Okay.
This is my last little experience. But there was a doorway near the end of the tunnel that was actually near the entrance where I came in. And this doorway looked out onto space. And there were galaxies and stars and planets, and it was utterly silent and utterly serene, and seemed, you know, if you could go out and float on that forever and be kind of numbly happy pretty much eternally. And there's also a sense of adventure too, though. Like if you went out there, you'd become like a voyager in the galaxy.
Right.
And I kind of hovered on this doorway. And another little being came up and started talking to me about what my options were at this point. And through the opening of the doorway, I could hear voices that were saying, "Come back, Sarah. You know, what about Zane?" which is my son's name. And I got very annoyed with them because I thought, why are they bothering me about my son? Of course, I'm aware that I'm going to be returning to my son and my body. But I could hear them kind of clamoring through the doorway. And so I spoke with this little other being at this doorway, and we were talking, and suddenly it was kind of like the doorbell with the other world, where a voice said, "If you pass through this door, you can't come back." And I thought, okay, well, I really don't want to go out there right now. And so I plopped myself back through the door where I came, and suddenly I was back in my body, and I was in a really brightly lit hospital bed, and there were all these tubes sticking into me, and I had a respirator in my face, and my body was humming with power. It was just full of electricity, but I couldn't move it at all because at that point I was pretty much completely paralyzed. And yet also, you know, I was full of joy. I had no fear of death. I had all this wonderful truth about myself. And I couldn't move, and I couldn't communicate it to anyone at all.
You couldn't even write then?
Oh, no, and I actually, at that point, it seemed like being in the hospital bed and being in my body and being so heavy was the abnormal part, do you know?
Yes, I do.
That was a jolt, and I really didn't want to be there for a moment. But then I settled into the fact that, oh, well, here I was. And then as the feeling of electricity faded, then I got the wonderful feeling of pain. So I knew I was back in my body because it hurt. And it's understandable considering the extent of my injury.
How long was it before you were able to either write or talk?
Talking took a month.
A month?
Because I was on the respirator for almost that whole month. Because my lungs had really been pretty badly damaged.
When you could talk, you began to communicate, I'm sure, didn't you? What happened to you?
I did, and the health practitioners who were wonderful in terms of saving my life were very, they were upset by what I was saying. They told me basically that the experience that I had was a result of the hallucinations from the fact that I'd been so badly hurt, and that none of what I'd experienced was real.
They told you that?
Yes. And I think that they were doing the best that they could in terms of the context of what they knew. You know, this is a fantastic occurrence. they had a job to do, which was to keep me alive, and that's more what they were concentrating on, other than trying to, fit what happened to me into the context of something that they knew. Since it was something outside what they knew, I don't really think they knew what to do with it.
There would be no way for you to correlate the events that you went through to the 5 times that you flatlined, would there? In other words, there would be...
In terms of time?
Or even synchronicity. In other words, you can't put together in your mind...
No, like if each time I flatlined, I might have been in one of those different worlds or something like that.
Sure.
It would be it'd be wonderful to say that happened.
But you don't know
I
that to be true.
honestly say that. All I can honestly say is that I know they lost me, and I know that this experience was obviously extended over a long period of time, because 3 days had passed before I returned to my body. And by then my parents were there, and I don't remember actually if I communicated much to them at all about it. I know I told my close circle of friends, but again, I met with a great deal of kind of skepticism. And again, everyone was kind of humoring me because I was so injured. So I really shut up about it. And I shut up about it really until I came here to Las Vegas and found the little advertisement that Trish had put in one of the papers saying that she had a support group that she was creating for people with near-death experience. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to other people who've had this experience, and then I'm not going to feel so alone and frightened and strange.
Have you met in the group or anywhere else anybody who had the experience you had?
I haven't met anybody who's had the same experience that I've had, but I've met other people who have had the same experience in terms of their lives have been transformed in the same way that mine was by the experience that they had.
And how is your life now different?
Well, the biggest thing that I learned from that is that I lost my fear of death. I lost any fear that I have of the fact that I will lose, upon death, my awareness of who I am.
Yeah. You know, Daniel...
That is such a comfort.
Daniel Brinkley tells me the same thing all the time. I mean, he just says, I'm not afraid.
I'm not. No, it's not that I necessarily want to go quickly into that experience again, okay?
Right.
But the point is, when it comes, I have an acceptance of it that I wish I could communicate to other people, because it is such a joy. Because nothing in my ordinary life now, no matter how hard it gets, can really shake my idea of who I am. And I know that even death will not dissolve my awareness of who I am. And I think that is one of the biggest things that people worry about when they die. They feel like they're going to disintegrate and disappear.
Cease to exist.
And that doesn't happen. I don't believe it happens at all. I think actually you have that death is a wonderful adventure, if you'll let it be. You know, I think that was one of the things about my experience, is that death can also have some horrific aspects to it, if that's your choice. But there's certainly many other avenues of death to explore.
Sarah,
yes.
Why do you think that the horrific aspects of that were your choice?
In my case?
Yes.
I think that they represented fear that I had of dying, because I did have a great fear of dying. I was very kind of morbid as a child. I liked horror movies and ghost stories and all that stuff, and I loved scaring myself. But I was really very afraid of death, and also really very ignorant of death. I really knew nothing about it. No one in my immediate circle of family had really died where I actually had a good experience of death. You know, I was ignorant of death, and I was afraid of death. And I think my horrific aspects of my near-death experience represented those things in myself.
Daniel Brinkley is now compelled to go to hospices and to help people die.
Yes, that was my first thing, too. The only reason why it never happened was because I was afraid that I would go and present myself to medical practitioners and they would turn me away as a lunatic.
Well, we've got a couple that didn't do that here on the phone. Sarah, I don't know how to thank you. I have never heard a story ever like yours, and it was remarkable.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Art. It's been wonderful to share it. I hope that other people will come forward and share their experiences too.
Maybe
so
now
we can
they
learn
will.
more.
Yeah, maybe now they will, Sarah.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you, and good night.
Okay.